So the subject of today's discussion is relationship with God. So it's part of the Relationship with God series. And we're calling it Understanding Your Emotional Self. Understanding your emotional self. Now, the reason why we've decided to have this chat with you today is because we feel the majority of people still don't understand one of the basic principles of the way to God. And that basic principle is this: without you becoming a fully fledged 100% emotional being, you will never have a relationship with God. Does everyone get that? Without you becoming a fully fledged 100% emotional being, there is no way that you'll ever become at one with God. And what we would like to talk to you about is how you do that, and the contrast between that and what many of you are currently doing. Does that make sense? And how much many of you invest in your emotions rather than actually allow your emotions. And we'll talk about what we mean by investing in them in comparison to allowing them. We'll talk about how many of you want to talk about emotion rather than feeling emotion. Does that make sense? And no real change can occur without you understanding that your soul is going to be 100% emotional. Like, you're going to be emotional all the time. So once you're at one with God, you will be emotional all the time. So the first thing we would like to say to you is this: the way you see things at the moment, the way you hear things, the way you interpret things, the way you taste things, and the way you touch things, and the way you believe things to be, with your intellect, the way you analyse things, the way you feel things at the moment, the way you see the universe around you, the way you see God and yourself and others around you, all of it is out of harmony with how God sees you. And do you know how we know that? Because if it was in harmony with how God sees you, you would already be at one with God. So what I'm basically saying to you is even the very way in which you think is completely out of harmony with the way God originally designed you to think. The way that you currently feel is out of harmony with the way God designed you to feel. The key is to not get all complicated about that, but to realise the truth of that. That the way God designed you to be is not the way you currently are. The way you currently are is has been completely controlled and manipulated by the environment in which you have lived. And that environment has been completely the opposite way of dealing with anything than the way God originally designed you to deal with everything. Completely the opposite. Now, I feel most of us have no concept of that at this stage. We believe the life we currently have is reality, and it's not. From God's perspective, it's not. And we are so addicted to this reality that we think that we understand what's being said to us when we have a discussion about divine truth, and we don't. What we have instead is even our thought and intellectual processes have been distorted by the environment in which we live so much that it's impossible for us to really understand what's going on, what's being said to us even. We interpret every statement of what's said to us through the filters that have all been distorted. It's like having a great big filter, like a water filter, and having it coloured with mud and then pushing some water through it and hoping that you're going to get some purity out the other end. And it's not possible. It's just not possible. So the question then becomes how do we get from that place where we're almost every single part of our life has been distorted in some way, where even the very way in which we think, the way in which we feel, the way we see the world, how we see things, how we even taste things and feel things and hear things is all distorted by these filters that have been placed within us at a very, very young age, usually soon after conception. How do we get from that place to being at one with God? is the question. And the answers are really simple, but the majority of us don't engage them. Right? And we would like to talk to you today in particular about emotion and its impact on your relationship with God. The type of being we need to become if we're ever going to have a relationship with God. Now, I think of God like God is the grand emotional being, if you like. If you want a definition of what it means to be an emotional being, God is it. Every single feeling God has is instantly transmitted to every single creation of God that God has a feeling for. And it's a constant flow of feelings that God has from God to all of God's creation. Now, the only one of God's creation that doesn't feel that flow is the human soul creation. And the only reason why we don't feel that flow is because God designed us with this beautiful trait that only the human soul has. And that is the trait of being able to determine for yourself what you desire to feel. Does that make sense? In other words, free will. That's what free will is. The ability to determine what you are going to feel. That's free will. Now, many of you probably haven't thought of free will that way. You thought of it like the ability to do whatever you want or whatever you desire. But it's also the ability to determine everything you feel for yourself. Does that make sense to you? You can ask questions at any time. Do you get that? Laura, you want to, if we just have the mic?
Sorry, I was just, the ability for us to feel...
To determine what you want to feel. That is free will. And when I say feel, emotionally experience. The ability for you to determine what you're going to emotionally experience is a part of free will, the gift of free will that God gave you. The main reason why many of us are not connecting with God is because we are determining what we want to feel that's out of harmony with what God would prefer for us to feel in order to have a connection with God. So it's actually our desire to use or to actually, in most cases, suppress our emotions that causes us to not have a connection with God. And then we throw up our hands and say, a connection with God's too hard. But a connection with God isn't hard. What's hard is doing what you're currently doing, suppressing your emotions almost 100% of the time. That's hard. It requires a lot of effort. You get a lot of spirit influence in that place. It just is really, really difficult in that place if you choose to suppress your emotions. But that is an expression of your free will. And God gave you that gift. So all of God's creations, all of God's other creations are feeling all of God's emotions all the time. Right? Now, of course, creations here on earth have a difficulty, and that is they also feel all of humanity's emotions all the time. So all the animals and the birds and the other living creatures and even right down to the viruses and everything all feel our emotions as well as God's. And this is where a distortion occurs. This is where problems get injected into the environment, if you like, through our emotional condition. And very few of us at this point really understand how much our emotions affect absolutely everything around us. Everything. And you know, without your emotions, you can't have a relationship with God. You can't have a relationship with yourself. You can't have a relationship with any other person. You can't understand or have a relationship with anything in the universe that God has created, because all of the things God has created in the universe are dependent upon you feeling something emotionally. You can't understand feelings. You can't understand the primary feeling that you're going to need to understand to grow, and that is love. And so your definitions are going to be completely flawed, right across the board. Right? It means that everything you look at, even the way you see it, is completely distorted. Right? So, for example, somebody gives you a gift, like us giving the gift of sharing our time with you, and you come to expect it. You no longer see it as a gift, you see it as something you can demand. that is a distortion of the truth about that. We have these distortions that occur all the time. Right? And we are constantly engaged in these distortions with the way we perceive everything. Most of us, our perception has been totally controlled and manipulated by the filters that we have. And if you could think of your brain like a great big processor, do you know what I mean? Like a processor of information. Now, I often think of the brain like a computer CPU, central processing unit, you know? And it just sits there, there's our central processing unit. And what does the central processing unit of a computer do? It just gets information fed to it, doesn't it? And then, of course, it makes decisions based on the information fed to it. Now, with us, most of the information that gets fed to our intellectual mind at this point in time is totally manipulated and filtered through our emotional condition. So even our thoughts that we have are completely incorrect in most cases from a point of view of harmony with love. The things we think are loving are not. We've got bad data in, and you're only going to get bad data out and bad decision making out of that. That's how it is. And that's the way we need to see it. Does that make sense? Now, instead of feeling all heavy about that, there is a very simple way that God made to make all this go away. And very few of us are engaging it because we are still thinking that we're already engaging it when we're not. Does that make sense to you? For example, many of us believe we have progressed when we have not. Many of us believe we understand divine truth when we do not. Right? Because the only way that you can progress and the only way you can understand divine truth is by feeling some emotion. And in fact, becoming a 100% feeling emotional being is the only way that you're going to understand God's truth. That's why there's a limitation in the sixth sphere of people with regard to their progression intellectually, because they can't understand anything that God has made. They can't even live in God's kingdom, if you like, the area above the eighth sphere or dimension, unless they make this transition into becoming a 100% emotional being. And most people who are listening to divine truth do not even understand that right now, even if they've been listening for 6 years or 7 years or 8 years. They don't understand that. They don't understand how important it is to become a 100% emotional being. To become 100% in that place where you're always feeling, never thinking, always feeling. When I say never thinking, thoughts will come from the feelings, not the other way around. At the moment, what we have is an intellectual dominant life. And the majority of us still have that. We're completely dominant intellectually. Now, we've talked in the past a lot about intellectual dominance, but many of you have not considered that your very way of existence with this intellectual dominance is completely out of harmony with the way God designed you to be. And many of you get complicated about that too. It's not even your fault that it's like that. Because by the time, for most of you, you were 3, 4 or 5 years of age, you were taught to think this way, look at life this way, see things this way, hear things this way, everything based through the emotional filters. Right? But the key is, how do we undo it? That's the key.